Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Stephen Hamilton, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for PCAC. Today we'll be talking with Sam Duncan from Wellington Advocacy on the Ontario Fall Economic Statement, the federal budget and how it relates to Ontario, as well as current political trends. This program is taped on November 13, 2025. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Renze.
Thanks, Stephen. Very happy to be here.
Great. Before we start talking about project labor agreements, maybe just very quickly with an organization called Cardus, a little bit about yourself and a little bit what Cardus does.
Yeah, thank you. So Cardus is an independent public policy think tank. We're based in Hamilton and have an office in Ottawa, which is where I'm located. And we do public policy research on a whole host of economic and social policy issues. I myself run a program called the Work and Economics Program, and our focus on work and economics is issues around employment policy, issues around labor relations policy as well. Cardus has decades of experience researching and writing on and proposing public policy on issues of construction, especially in the labor relations field. It's actually the origins of Cardus is in this space, and one of the focuses that we've been insistent upon in the last several decades is open tendering and how labor relations affects competitiveness in Ontario's construction markets. That's really what led to the report that were released recently, looking at how PLAs, project labor agreements, are reigniting some of the debates that have existed for a long time in Ontario's labor relations markets.
So a few weeks ago, we had Keith Burkhardt, a labor lawyer, come on and talk about project labor agreements. So some of our listeners may be familiar with what project labor agreements are. That interview was more of a nuts and bolts about kind of the legal framework in the Ontario Labor Relations Act for project labor agreements. So we're not going to get so much into that, but kind of more structurally, what is a project labor agreement? How is it different than a normal construction agreement? How is it different than a collective agreement? And maybe shed some light on why you think they're problematic.
Yeah, thanks. This is a very important context. Project labor agreement is fundamentally an agreement on the labor relations between a union or a set of labor unions and the proponent or the owner of a construction project. It tends to set the conditions for how labor relations are going to go for a specific construction project, and it can set up a whole range of issues, including wage rates and the terms and conditions of employment on a construction project. So this is important because it differs from a collective agreement. A collective agreement is usually between a construction company and a union, and so what that means is that PLAs can actually be used to bypass collective agreements. It can be used to bypass also the construction company itself and go directly to the proponent of a construction project. But one of the important things in Ontario is that although PLAs are exceptions to collective agreements, they accept the basic framework of collective agreements and building trade unions in the province of Ontario. And that leads to some problems when it comes to how PLAs are implemented, which I think we're going to get to in a bit.
That's interesting. So they are kind of a unique feature and kind of unusual in that sense, right? Because they're superimposed on top of existing collective agreements, but they're borrowing the basic framework of those collective agreements. Obviously, from the Progressive Contractors Association standpoint and our members who are signatories with CLAC, they're problematic because the way the Labor Relations Act is structured intentionally leaves out progressively unionized companies like CLAC because only provincial IC&I agreements, contractors with provincial IC&I agreements and those unions can participate in these structures. So by definition, all our members are excluded, as well as the entire non-union sector. So there's an issue with legislation. So I think that was probably a function of the legislation, it was intentional, I would think, when it was in past decades ago. But maybe walk through kind of other issues that you see as problematic within the basic structure of it.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the problem is the history of how PLAs were introduced into the Ontario Labor Relations Act. So in the late 90s, it was the Mike Harris government that brought in PLAs. and they were brought in as exceptions. Now, the goal, I think, at least the stated goal of the government at the time, was to ensure stable labor relations in construction in Ontario. They must have, looked at some of the some instability in the markets at the time, and they were concerned that that would be impacting the ability to bring investment into Ontario construction. And so they brought this in, but I, whether it was on purpose or not, I wasn't there at the time to know. But the effect of what they did is that they made project labor agreements. They stuck it into the part of the act that deals with the IC&I construction sector, and they made these exceptions to collective agreements. I think, you could look at that and say that the theory of this is that it would actually allow for a big construction project to not have to go through the 3-year cycle that happens in with these collective agreements. I think that's one way of looking at it and saying with maybe what they were trying to do. But the effect of it, you're right, Stephen, is that a large number of companies will be shut out from PLAs simply because they're not affiliated with building trade unions, or their workers are not affiliated with building trade unions. So you're right, that would shut out any company whose workers are affiliated with CLAC or other progressive unions, but it would also shut out any company that is not affiliated with the union at all. And what that does is it means that first of all, there's going to be a shrinking of the labor supply that is available to work on projects, that are subject to a PLA. But it also means that there's going to be less competition for those projects because there's going to be fewer firms that are even eligible to bid, even if they might be eligible on everything else, and they could do the work if the PLA allowed them to. They just can't because they're not affiliated with the right kind of union. And we think that's wrong, but it also leads to, as you can imagine, higher costs as well.
So from the PCA perspective, historically, the way these have been implemented was almost exclusively in the private sector. It was between a private owner,
right,
private contractors. And so there is a freedom to contract in Ontario. While the structure is problematic, certainly like these arrangements, while not ideal for our members, did happen. But it is notable, like when I interviewed Keith Burkhardt, there's only been like less than 30 PLAs in the history of the legislation, considering there's thousands of construction contracts issued annually in the private and public sector. It is remarkable how rare these are. And I guess one of the benefits, maybe you could talk to, but there's obviously a trade-off. You're talking about labor stability, and then you're excluding a component of the marketplace. Maybe talk about, if you were a proponent or you were kind of on the other side looking at this, what are some of the benefits of a project labor agreement?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 things that people will point to when it comes to PLAs as having some benefits. I'm not personally convinced that all of them are as beneficial as some people might make them out to be, but let's go through them. Like the first one is that people will cite is that PLAs allow for more stability in labor relations, fewer strikes, fewer lockouts, and that kind of thing. But I think one thing we have to remember is that the Ontario collective agreement system already provides for some stability in that, and so why it's absolutely necessary to bring in a whole new superstructure to ensure even greater labor stability. I'm not sure that's the benefits outweigh the costs in that case. But still, that's one. But it means though that it makes the union membership in certain labor unions an inherent part of the PLA model. That's kind of the basic deal. The people are saying that we're going to allow for more stable labor relations, but the cost of that is we're going to require membership in the building trade unions, and so there's this kind of deal. I'm not sure it's the best deal, but that's what some people will say.
Sorry to interrupt. It is interesting. Like if you go back the last 10, 15 years, the amount of strikes in the IC&I construction sector is actually remarkably low. So in terms of work stoppages that this is attempting to address, it just isn't a problem that perhaps proponents say it is. And again, that's probably why we're not seeing a lot of them. We'll finish this discussion about the benefits, but next is kind of the one oddity that happened a few years ago, the Ottawa Hospital, and why that's perhaps a little unique.
Yeah, well, the other one is that it can allow for harmonization of work hours and lunchtime breaks and that kind of thing. But frankly, a wall-to-wall contract can do the same thing. So, I think they're actually in some ways trying to mimic the virtue of another model out there that isn't always allowed for under that part of the act. So something to think about. And then the third one is that governments will sometimes say, oh, we can bring in more community benefits, like we can increase the employment opportunities for, women in the trades or members of other groups that are not always well represented in the trades. And that might be a laudable goal, but there are ways to do that don't involve restricting competition and restricting who can bid on procurement projects. And we have a whole report about how that can be done. You can use community benefit agreements. Now, sometimes those can bring in the same kind of restrictive measures that PLAs in Ontario can bring in, but there are ways of doing community benefit agreements in a way that does not do that. And so that's what we would point to. Like all these benefits that people point to for PLAs, there are better ways that these can be accomplished.
And I think that's a good segue for the Ottawa Hospital. If you look at the communication from the hospital when they were negotiating with building trade unions in Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec, one of the main things, at least outward facing, that they were communicating to people was the community benefits that were kind of incorporated into this agreement. And I believe there's a 5% aspirational goal for a percentage of the workers to be women, underrepresented groups. Again, at first blush, number one, 5% seems quite low and very easy to manage. And the second point is these are aspirational goals and they're not enforceable in any fashion within the contract. So from our perspective, this was all a bit of a smokescreen for something else. And we can talk about the Ottawa Hospital, why that's perhaps more pernicious. Within that structure as well, there is a kind of agreement between the building trade unions and the hospital itself for donations. Your paper doesn't get into that, but certainly from the hospital's perspective, that was one of the main reasons they probably entered into it, because they would get an infusion in donations as a result of this agreement. Again, from our perspective, it's the province primarily that's funding it and would have to pay for the additional costs as a result of the project labor agreement on the project. And so there's kind of that weird dynamic that was part of this discussion. But again, maybe just briefly talk about a little bit about the Ottawa Hospital, why it's this unique outlier, and how, I guess, looking at your paper, using that as a case study on why the province should really be cautious in applying this, although it didn't directly apply it here. The hospital was the owner, but certainly why the province should be hesitant to look at these as models when it's funding infrastructure.
Yeah, so the issue with the Ottawa Hospital is it's the first one in the public sector that we've seen in the province of Ontario. I'm not aware of any other ones in the public sector. Like you mentioned earlier, there's a few handfuls of PLAs used in the private sector in the history of this thing since 1998, when it was introduced in the Ontario Labour Relations Act. So it's the first one, and I think that governments need to be cautious about this for two reasons mainly. The first one is cost, which is especially in an era when governments' deficits are ballooning and governments are actually looking for ways to do more with less. In an era of scarcity, there aren't a lot of construction dollars that can be just left on the table by governments, and this is one of the ways that construction money is left on the table, because what happens is that when you introduce a PLA with a specific set of building trade unions, you restrict usually what you're going to do. And there's a report here that said that showed that 96% of the private sector PLAs actually have some form of mandatory union membership in their model. 96%. And so, and what that does is it's going to limit the ability and willingness of some construction companies from bidding on those projects. Obviously, when you restrict the kind of businesses that can bid on something, that's going to reduce competition, and when you reduce competition, that's going to increase prices for taxpayers. And we did a study on the City of Toronto that has a similar model in its procurement, and that showed that it's leaving $347 million every year on the table that it could be using to deploy to other kinds of construction projects that it just doesn't do anymore. And then there was another think tank bank, the Montreal Economic Institute, that showed a similar range on the Ottawa hospital itself in terms of potential cost overruns ranging from 168 million to 525 million because of the PLA that was put on it. But the other thing I would say is that the other problem with the Ottawa Hospital PLA is that it's just not fair to workers. We have workers in Canada have a right to freedom of association under the Charter of Rights, and that includes the right to associate with one union or another, or not to be affiliated at all if they so choose. And I don't think the governments should be putting their thumb on the scale. And I think governments have a special responsibility to respect that freedom of association. So those are the things I would point to: the cost and the fairness to workers that are undermined by PLAs in Ontario.
So if you look at the provincial government's infrastructure capital plan over the next 10 years, very ambitious. It's over $200 billion that they're anticipating to spend. So a lot of money going towards new highways, Highway 413, potentially an underground tunnel under the 401, new hospitals, like really across the board. Every component of infrastructure is getting quite a big infusion of spending. I guess within that context, this paper is very timely, right? It's a cautionary note that if you want to spend efficiently on infrastructure, this is probably the last way of doing it. There's a number of other things they could be doing better. But certainly, if you look at the Ottawa Hospital, there was only one bidder, one general contractor that put forward a bid and won the contract. We think there's a reason for that. But you do want more. You do want more than one bid on these mega projects for a $2.8 billion hospital. This is not a good model going forward if the province is only getting one or two proponents. And so the more construction companies, the more workers that can take part. I'll send it back to you. Going forward is there's the project labor agreements. What other components do you think in terms of efficiencies, in terms of productivity gains, do you think the province should be looking towards to make sure those $200 billion are effectively spent?
Yeah, so I would point to there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about labor shortages, and that contributing to bottlenecks or just the inability of governments and other entities to getting the work done that they need to get done. I think the last thing you want to do is further restrict that supply of labor that is able to work on this, and therefore also restrict the companies that are out there who can help to build this infrastructure. So PLAs are one way of restricting it, and I just don't think that's the right mode to go forward. If you just think about the amount of money that's involved with this, when the city of Hamilton, they used to be under something called restrictive tendering, where construction projects were the company could only procure with companies affiliated with building trade unions. And when they moved to open tendering, where they could procure from a number of different companies, they estimated that they would see savings of 21%. And if you think about how much 21% is, that's on a $200 billion budget. That's a huge amount of money, and there's a huge number of construction projects that the government could afford if it just expanded the eligibility to companies that can actually do the work, and not base that eligibility on whether their workers are affiliated with the right kind of union or not. So I guess that's what I would say. I would encourage governments to not go in the wrong direction of further restricting the labor supply, but go and find the workers that can. There's a lot of workers out there. They just need to open up the doors of construction projects to those workers and to the companies that they work for.
Last question. The paper concludes saying that this is a move away from Bill 66.
Right.
Bill 66 is what you're referring to when you're talking about the city of Hamilton, Waterloo region, being able to bid competitively for their construction projects. That bill was introduced early on in 2019. And really, the project labor agreement kind of runs in the face of what that was trying to achieve. And so I guess the final question is kind of framing it within the Bill 66 discussion. There's obviously a heavy caution on not using PLAs. looking at other provinces, I know your paper didn't really get into this. Is it your position that the province should not do these types of arrangements on public projects? Or I guess it's an and/or there's legislative change that guarantees a no strike, no lockout provision for a duration of a project that other companies can participate in it?
Well, fundamentally, I don't think the Ontario government should be pursuing these PLAs, because the way the legislation is constructed in Ontario, it's already assuming a framework that is not helpful to getting the workers that they need and the companies that they need to build the Ontario infrastructure going forward. And if they were to go down this road, they would need to fundamentally rethink how the legislation in Ontario is written, which is a huge task. You know, there are certainly improvements that could be made to the Ontario Labour Relations Act, but this would not be a surgical change to the act. This would be a revolutionary one, I think. So, you know, I think the best course of action if is just not go down the road of using PLAs. I think other provinces have tried to use this. I would point to British Columbia as an example of where they have something called the BC Community Benefit Agreement, which is basically a PLA that restricts labor on certain construction projects to building trade union labor, and it's been a mess, frankly. You know, there's been problems there with cost overruns with another hospital that they've been working on out there, and it's led to situations where members of the First Nation, the local First Nation on whose territory the hospital is being built, can't actually participate because they don't want to be unionized, and it's just it leads to problems. So I think. I think fundamentally, the government should not pursue these, but because there are other mechanisms for achieving the policy goals that I think that they might be interested in.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining. Thank you for joining us today. This is a really interesting conversation. Again, the paper "Watch Your Step: PLAs and the Risks to Competitive Bidding in Ontario." Renze, I hope to have you on again.
Thank you, Stephen. Nice to be here.